Hey guys, it's Warhammer Shawn coming to you today. This is basically why I kind of started the blog in the first place. I wanted to get to the meat and potatoes of things and kind of discuss the new 7th edition Warhammer 40k. I basically kind of poured through the rules and referenced mainly for our league to try to kind of answer some frequently asked questions or kind of go through some of the rules that may be changed from last edition. So I wanted to kind of go through those and discuss them because I've been looking around at different vlogs and blogs and stuff like that have talked about the new edition, but they haven't really, I think, gone through some of the steps to basically kind of go through the pages and tell you some of the changes in depth. And I've kind of combed through the book in nauseam, and so I figured I would start going through stuff, maybe broken up to a couple different places depending on how long this ends up being. So what I'll be doing here while I'm talking about this, I'll just be putting some pictures up of some of my models from different armies that I have, just so you don't have to look at my mug while I'm talking, and you can be entertained by those pictures, hopefully. So let's look at the big rule book. Let's look at page 22 and Psychic Focus. This is a really cool change. Is if all of your powers are taken from one discipline, then the Psyker can have the Primary's power for free, even if they're only level 1 Psykers, which is pretty interesting. Like a level 1 Psyker may attempt to manifest 2 powers if there is enough warp charges or warp points left, which is also on page 24. This is big. Like the Tyranids right now can only get powers from one table, which is basically there, so they basically get Dominion for free, and things like Eldar Warlocks, which only get 1 power, will get the Primary's power for free. So I think this is really cool for Psykers, and especially level 1 Psykers, because you may be able to get more than 1 power off with them, and they may be able to have some interesting powers. So I think this is a good cool change. Psykers in a transport can only manifest Witchfire powers while embarked on a transport. However, the vehicle must have a fire point with line of sight to the intended target, and that's on page 25. That nerfs Psykers a little bit, because now you really can't even bless the squad that is inside the transport with the Psyker, or even affect the transport itself, which you used to be able to do. So that's a little bit of a nerf. You can still fire shooting type attacks, Witchfire powers, out of a transport if it has a fire point, but that did take a little bit of a nerf, which is too bad, but it's just what happens. It's the way the rules change. But it's important to remember that, because if remember, you don't do it, and if somebody does do it when you're playing against them, just remember that that's something that they can't do now. And that's on page 25. The perils chart, now if you roll double 6s, you have to roll on perils chart. The result of a 1, you basically can't take any cover saves, and feel no pain isn't allowed for basically a D6 strength 6 AP 1 hits. The attack comes from where the Psyker was. Cover is granted, as in for barrage attacks from the Psyker out. The unit may go to ground for a 6-up cover and may take feel no pain rolls if not affected by instant death rule due to strength 6. So that's on page 25 as well. And basically the psychic powers have kind of changed. There's a whole new psychic phase now, which, if anyone remembers from, well, 2nd edition, when they introduced Dark Millennium, there was kind of a psychic phase then too, but kind of went away, and it's kind of like fantasy now. I think it takes a lot of the confusion out of it, because a lot of times people were kind of confused, like, when do I cast this power, when do I do this? Now it's all at one time, which I think is good. I think it's nice, so I think it makes it pretty easy to do. It makes it challenging too, because you basically get warp charges. You roll a dice, and then your opponent gets the same number of basically dice to roll, and you get a dice for every psyker level that you have psychers present. I can see this being abused a little bit where you have, basically psychically heavy armies like demons and Eldar, where some of these armies like Necrons and Sisters of Battle and like Black Templars aren't going to have very much because they don't have psychers. And it's a little weird because like Sisters of Battle all have adamantium will, so they all have an ability to basically kind of block psychic powers innately. And so it just kind of seems like there should be something to help them out a little bit. I don't quite agree with how that's done, but it's kind of hard. I just think the abuse potential is there. I've seen, and I'm sure many of you have seen some battle reports out there that Frontline Gaming has done where they have like 40 dice to roll and the opponent has like 6, and so there's just no way you're going to be able to manifest a power against that. Anyway, definitely a discussion that will have to be decided by tournaments and tournament organizers on what they're going to do about that if they do anything. If you do not have warp charges or warp points to expend, you may not attempt to deny the witch, as well as basically trying to deny a power, which like we were just talking about, that's on page 26. Psychic hoods have changed a little bit. If you're within 12 inches of basically one of your units that's being targeted, you can use the wearer of the psychic hood's deny the witch ability to try to deny the power versus the unit that it's being cast against, which I think is kind of cool. Focus Witchfire powers can only pick out models if an enemy unit has enough warp charge points that are harnessed above where the warp charge points needed to manifest the power. Meaning, if the Focus Witchfire power took 2 charge points, you'd have to get 3 or more to be able to pick out the models, or basically kind of like focus out a model. Otherwise, if it's equal to, then it's not focused Witchfire power, but it's just the closest model in the unit instead. It's on page 27. If a Perils slays the Psyker, but the power is successfully manifested, and it's however, like it's a malefic power where it's possession, does the power still replace the Psyker with a demon? If it's failed, that's on page 25 and 195. Boy, I don't know. It's kind of up to debate. It doesn't, I would say you'd have to successfully manifest the power and not peril yourself to death to get the demon, but it doesn't really say for sure. So, any comments, let me know. I will leave my email address, but you can also comment on the YouTube page as well. I'm interested to hear what you guys have to say. Here's a really big change. It's a change from 6th to 7th edition, which I think is pretty cool. I think it's fair. A unit that's gone to ground may not fire Overwatch. That's page 30. I think that's fair because I always kind of thought it was a little weird that you could go to ground and get charged and you weren't any less prepared when they were charged. Someone was charging in. So I think that's a fair change. I really do. If when you're shooting through a unit to another unit, that usually confers a 5+ cover save. However, when the elevated model is not if there's an elevated model and the models aren't intervening, it does not receive the cover save. I don't really know what constitutes an elevated unit. If say you have a war walker that's shooting at demon prince that's behind a unit of pink horrors, is that elevated enough where you don't get the cover save? I'd still say you would, but I don't really know where that's. They didn't really give a good example of that. That's on page 38. Primary weapons, they fire no matter if the super heavy vehicle moved or not. This is on page 42, so it's kind of talking about super heavy vehicles, which are in now. They're in the force organization chart, so they're here to stay, which I'm fine with. I think, we'll get to it, but they changed D weapons to make them fair. Another point, a unit is allowed to charge a unit that it cannot harm, and that's on page 45. And that's a change from last edition. Last edition, you could charge basically a unit, like a creature or a monstrous creature unit that you couldn't harm, but you couldn't charge a vehicle that you couldn't harm. And there was some debate whether you could do that to a super heavy walker or a walker, and now they've kind of clarified that with the rules, so I think that's a good change. It's kind of a way for some armies to be able to maybe charge in a unit of like gaunts into a Imperial Knight, so that they can hopefully tie it out for a few turns before it wreaks havoc on the rest of the army. I think that's a good change. I like that rule change. Overwatch casualties and wounds taken from failed dangerous terrain checks are not counted in the total wounds done in close combat for purposes of close combat resolution. That's a change. Last edition it did, but this edition it doesn't. That's page 52. So just important to know that, because it is a change from last edition, that the Overwatch casualties do not count towards the total number of wounds done in a close combat phase. Units that have failed morale automatically fail morale tests, and they do pass all pinning tests. They cannot go to ground, and if they're charged, they have to take a regrouping test at full leadership. If they fail, they're run down and destroyed. When they're falling back from a close combat, distances rolled within 1 inch of an enemy model. It basically, if you're running away from close combat and you still have a model that's within 1 inch of an enemy model, you get to move your model at least 1 inch away from the enemy unit. If the unit is trapped by surrounding troops or impassable terrain, then it cannot fall back, then it's destroyed. That's page 58. Excuse me, it's a little confusing on the morale test, but basically a unit that's falling back can't be pinned, and it can't go to ground. And if they do get charged, they can retest or test leadership at full morale or full leadership, which is different than like if they're below 25% and they need double ones to come turn around. If they get charged, they get to test at full leadership, but if they fail it, they're destroyed. Next rule change: if a swooping, flying, monstrous, or gargantuan creature is shot down during any phase, it may charge in its subsequent phase. However, if it began its turn swooping and changed its mode to glide mode, it cannot charge the same player turn. That's on page 68. That's a big change too. Now you can't just go out of swooping mode and go into glide mode and charge. However, if you're shot at in your opponent's previous turn and you actually get grounded, you can, because it's a different turn that it happens, so you can actually charge. So it's something to think about, and it's something to think about for the people that are shooting at monstrous creatures, is they need to make sure that they can kill them. But a new change now is that flying monstrous creatures and gargantuan creatures only take grounding tests if they've been wounded, and it's at the end of the phase that they're wounded. So when they're shooting, basically all the shooting is going to be done before they even take a grounding test. So if they fail, then they're on the ground. They could potentially be charged, but they're not grounded. Another thing that could happen is that they could fire a witch firepower and shoot them from the psychic power and drop them to the ground before shooting phase began. Then they'd be on the ground. But they kind of almost need to take care of those flying monstrous creatures, because if it goes to their turn, they're probably going to get owned pretty bad. Moving on, a gargantuan creature that is not flying moves 12 inches, but when it's going through difficult terrain, it doesn't really say. It says that it moves like a monstrous creature, but it seems kind of unfair that flying monsters, creatures can jump 12 inches because they kind of ignore the effects of terrain. And vehicles that are super heavy vehicles, super heavy walkers, ignore the effects of terrain, so they get to go 12 inches no matter what. But gargantuan creatures that are on foot, how do they move through difficult terrain? If you roll 3d6 and pick the highest, the maximum they can go is 6 inches. I think they ought to be able to go more than that. I don't know what we're going to do for our league. What we did in the past was we rolled 3d6, and you take the 2 highest dice results and add them together. But I'm not really sure. So that one's kind of left open. That's on page 70. Page 70. The other thing that's kind of not really answered is gargantuan creatures, if they're wounded or if they're shot with poison weapons, instead of normally being wounded on a 4-up, they get wounded on a 6-up. And sniper rifles only wound them on a 6-up versus 4-up. But the grav guns wound them normally, which that was an answer I got from Forge World, which they clarified. So they do wound them on whatever their armor value is or AP value is. But excuse me. But what do death marks do? I would assume their normal poison would work on a 6-up. But if they mark the unit, are they wounding on 2-ups like they would anything else? Or would it be 4-up because it's 2 better than the 6-up? I don't know. I think that seems fair. Being able to wound a gargantuan creature on a 2-up seems pretty easy to kill them that way, but there's not really an answer for it, and hopefully GW will FAQ it. A drop pod dropping does become immobilized but does not lose a hull point. That's just been clarified for certain. It's something that most tournaments have run that way, but they've just clarified it now. That's on page 76. That's good that they clarified it. Damage table changed. So now 1 through 3 is just shaken. And the 4 is stunned. And then 5 is weapon destroyed. 6 is immobilized. And then 7 is explosion. So if you don't have a high or a low AP weapon, you're not going to be able to one-shot a vehicle, which I think is fair. Another thing that changed that a lot of people aren't talking about right now, they're talking about that damage change, which is interesting. But the other thing that changed in the damage table that nobody seems to have noticed is that a stunned flyer cannot turn and it goes 18 inches forward. That's the same as last edition. But if a flyer gets immobilized, which is a result of a 6, the person controlling the flyer rolls a dice. On a 1 or a 2, it crashes and burns. On a 3 plus, it's stunned result, just like what's described in the stun result. That's a big change because it used to be locked velocity. Now it's not anymore, which I really hated locked velocity anyway. But a 1 or a 2, I mean, it's possible that you may crash and burn a flyer just by getting an immobilized result. So that's kind of changed it for the flyer a little bit. And also the stun result, and it's hard to do, but sometimes, if you got a flyer in front of you and, you can kind of position yourself before the shooting phase that if they have to go 18 inches and they end up landing on your units, they're going to crash and burn. So you can kind of position yourself to kind of, even if they just get stunned, to take out flyers that way. If you can do it tactically, and if you get like a horde army is really good at this. So I think that's an interesting change. It's on page 76. I don't think a lot of people have talked about it, but I think it's something to look at because it does change it for the flyers quite a bit. Excuse me. Cover saves are granted to vehicles if 25% of the vehicle is obscured, and they get the cover save of the terrain that they're behind. So, for example, woods, you get a 5-out cover save. But this is different than 6th edition. If you're behind ruins and 25% obscured, you get a 4+ cover save. Well, it used to be 25%, you just get a 5-up no matter what you were behind. So that's a change. If the entirety of the facing is obscured from the shooter's perspective, meaning, let's say you're shooting at a vehicle, but the front arc is what you're facing, but the front arc is completely obscured, and you're hitting at, you actually can only see the side arc, then you get +1 to the cover save. So if you were in ruins, you'd get a 3+ cover save. If you were in woods, you get a 4+ cover save. That's on page 77. So that's a change too. That's important to think about. Another thing with cover saves, with all like skimmers and bikes and even flyers and flying monster creatures right now, when you go to jink, you have to decide if you're going to jink before they start rolling to shoot at you. So it's not after they've already shot you, it's before. And that's a big change too from last edition. But the cool thing is that the jink saves are now 4 up instead of 5 up. But you don't get a +1 to your bonus for turbo boosting like you did in the last edition. So jet bikes at turbo boost are only going to get 4 up and not get a 3 up. But if they don't turbo boost, they still get a 4 up. So a non-walker vehicle is treated as having weapon skill 1 unless it's immobilized, in which case it's treated as a weapon skill 0. So what's interesting is that no matter if a vehicle moved or not, let's say you have a big vehicle like a Lehman Russ that didn't move at all, when you attack it in close combat, you don't automatically hit it anymore. You basically are hitting it on 3s. That's a big change. Last edition they had to move to get that. If they didn't move, they got hit automatically. Now you only get hit automatically if you're immobilized. That's on page 78. So that's a big change. Squadrons have individual vehicles may choose to flat out, but others don't have to, but they just have to remain in 4-inch coherency. So that's a change too. Last time if you had a squadron of vehicles, they all had to move flat out. Now some can move flat out, some don't have to, but they just have to stay within a coherency. That's on page 79. If a vehicle is affected by the damage chart, then the unit being transported must take a leadership test. If the leadership test is passed, it acts normally. If it's failed, then the unit that's in the vehicle may only snap fire shots in the shooting phase, but is otherwise unaffected. So that's a change with vehicles from the last edition, is that you've got troops inside. They have to take a morale test. If they pass it, then they just act normally. If they don't, then they have to snap fire shots. That's on page 82. When the transport vehicle suffers an explosion result, the wounds are randomly allocated and not assigned by the controlling player. That is huge too, because last edition, when your vehicle exploded, you got to decide. Your opponent got to decide who took the wounds and when they'd roll for it. Now it's randomly allocated. That's important to remember. It's randomly allocated, not determined by the person that controls the models. In a regular vehicle, it's strength 4 AP dash. A super heavy vehicle or a zooming flyer is strength 10 AP 2. And then it's the number of passengers times those. That's how many hits you get, and then you roll the wound just like you would normally. That's in the big rule book at page 82 and page 94 for super heavies. Just keep that in mind, because that's a big change also. And I see a lot of people that have been talking about it or vlogging about it and haven't really mentioned some of these things, and I think that's important to keep in mind. I guess we talked about this already, but skimmers and jet bikes decide to jink prior to rolls hit, and they must snap fire in the next shooting phase. That's a little bit of a hit, because last edition only the flyers had to snap fire next turn. The skimmers and jet bikes got to shoot regular. I think that's fair. I mean, if you're going to jink to get a cover save, you should snap fire, because you had to hard jink to save yourself. So that's on page 84. This is coming from an elder player, so yeah, it sucks a little bit, but I think it's a fair rule change, because that's what they're doing, so I think it's fair that they had to snap fire. Now, another change, walkers swivel 45 degrees vertical and horizontal to shoot their weapons. They do not fire in any direction now. That's a change from all the last couple editions. Walkers were always treated as kind of infantry. They could fire any direction as long as they weren't immobilized. despite whatever their facing was. Now you have to be very cognizant of where your facing is, because you can't just kind of turn on the spot. The walkers can fire Overwatch, but if they're immobilized, they can only fire Overwatch if the weapons are in the arc that they're charging from. This is on page 90. Walkers are the exception to the rule and get +1 attack for each extra close combat weapon that they have after the first one. Meaning normally if you have 2 close combat weapons, you get a bonus attack for normal infantry. But if you have 3 close combat weapons, it doesn't help you at all. But a walker, if they have 3 close combat weapons, they get actually 2 extra attacks because of the 2 extra close combat weapons they have. That's on page 91. Walkers cannot make a sweeping advance or pile-in move in close combat if they're immobilized or stunned. Something to keep in mind too, that's on page 91. A walker that is rammed may not make a death or glory attack. However, it may assault the vehicle in the close combat phase if it survives. That's on page 91. That's a change from last edition too, where it could make a death or glory attack. Ram has no distance modifiers anymore. That's a change. Now it's half the armor value of the facing that's being rammed or ramming. So if your armor value 14, you'd be a 7. You get +1 for being a tank and +2 for being a super heavy or heavy vehicle or a building. That's on page 93. If a ram does not result in an explosion, then the ram stops. Rex stopped ramming vehicles. It's only an exploded vehicle which allows you to keep going, and that's on page 93. Super heavies suffer an explosion result when it loses its last hull point. But if you get an explosion result when you're rolling on the damage chart, it doesn't automatically explode a super heavy vehicle. You just lose D3 hull points plus the original point that you were the original hull point it was stripping off. So that's on page 94. Sorry, a little break there. Need to get some water. So the next rule we're going to talk about is the stomp rule. Stomp rule states that you get D3 blast templates. Each blast template is resolved on the stomp table, and the effects of each model are rolled for the chart for each blast template. So the first one, let's say you get 3, you roll a D3, you get 3 blast templates. The first one has to be touching the model's base, and then after that, each one after that can be touching the template, the previous template, and it can overlap if you want it to. But when you're rolling to see damage and that sort of thing, you do each template separately. So let's say there's 4 models under the first template. You roll on the stomp chart and see what happens with those 4 models before you go to the next one. You don't roll them for all the same. It doesn't say, and I've asked GW to FAQ it, but it doesn't say under the stomp rules whether or not you can affect a unit that's not in close combat but within range of those blast templates. You know, let's say you're next to another enemy unit that you're not in close combat with. Can the stomp affect that? I would propose that it shouldn't, as I don't think that's fair that you can stomp something that you're not even close combat with, and that would really make it hard for people to prevent a unit from just rampaging through their own units. So I would propose that it can only affect the units it's in close combat with. It's up to you guys. What do you guys think? Hopefully they'll FAQ it soon. That's on page 96. The next thing for weapon upgrades, vehicle upgrades. For vehicle upgrades, a dozer blade not only lets you reroll dangerous terrain checks, which is what it did in the past, it also adds +1 to the AV when you're ramming. So when we just talked about the ram value, it adds +1 to the ram value with having a dozer blade. That's a pretty big thing, change. That's on page 98. Extra armor upgrades results in when you get a result of a crew stunned, it results in a crew shaken automatically. There's no roll needed anymore, which is nice, and that's on page 98. The searchlight, once a vehicle equipped with a searchlight hits a target, it is spotlighted and does not benefit from the stealth benefit anymore for night fighting. But neither does a vehicle that just targeted it with the light. So basically, you spotlight them, it gets rid of the night fighting special rule, but it also does for the vehicle that has a spotlight. Night fighting changed as well. Now there's no range limitations on how far you can shoot, and everything just gets stealth. There's no measuring how far away something is, just everything gets stealth unless you have night vision. The searchlight rule is on page 98. There can be only one challenge per close combat. Until it's resolved, another challenge cannot be declared. A glorious intervention may be attempted after the first round of combat, close combat. However, this has changed too. Glorious intervention may only be attempted on your turn. You can't do it on the other player's turn, and it can't be on the first round of close combat. That's in page 101, and it's kind of a clarification because I never really said before after you declared a challenge whether that they stayed in that challenge or you had to reissue it every turn, and so a lot of places have been running it that you have to reissue it. Now they've kind of just settle it that it's, once you issue the challenge, you're stuck in that challenge until one of the models is killed. Then you can issue another challenge, which is cool. That's on page 101, and the attempting glorious intervention is on page 103. Looking at some of the new ruins and stuff, the Imperial Statuary grants a 3+ cover for those behind it. I don't know if that's just an attempt to sell this Imperial Statuary, because that just seems really stupid to give a 3+ cover versus so that's better than a wall. What the hell? The statue makes it better than a wall. That doesn't make any sense to me. Ruins, barricades, walls, tank traps, gun emplacements, rubble grant a 4+ cover save. Woods and area terrain grant a 5+ cover save. Craters and tangleware grant a 6+ cover save. Now this is important. Craters last time were 5+ cover. Now craters are only a 6+ cover. And all of these covers for infantry or monstrous creatures, the save is the same no matter how obscured the model is. So if a monstrous creature is in a let's say rubble, it gets a 4+ cover no matter what. Going to ground for things that it increases the cover save by 1, with the exception of the Aegis Wall. The Aegis Wall still grants you a +2 to your cover save, so you go from a 4 up to a 2 up for cover. And the crater has changed. That actually gives you +2 to cover, so now you go from a 6 up to a 4 up if you go to ground. Area terrain has changed. Last edition and 6th edition, if you went to ground in area terrain, you got +2 to your cover. But now that's not true. Now area terrain is a 5+ cover, and you get +1 for going to ground, so at max it's a 4 up. So that's a change, and so as well as craters from last edition, and that's on page 109. The Imperial Statuary, I don't know what the heck I was thinking on that one. Gun emplacements can be fired manually, and they can only be fired by non-vehicle models. So this includes walkers. So that's a change, because they were kind of not clear about who can fire gun emplacements. Sometimes people were doing shenanigans with vehicles last edition, and then most places kind of adopted a rule that vehicles couldn't do it, and they fact that the vehicles couldn't do it, but they didn't say anything about walkers. Now it looks like walkers can't do it. That's page 109. Gun emplacements are auto hit in close combat, and they can be charged and they can be targeted by shooting. So that's a little bit of a change too. Does this count for first blood? Some tournament organizers don't count gun emplacements as first blood. It looks like in the rules for 7th edition, it looks like it actually does count for First Blood. So my guess is that it does, unless your TO changes that. That's on page 109. Units disembarking from buildings may charge the same turn that they disembark. So that's kind of a cool change. That's on page 110. So you can get out of your bastion and still charge that turn. Haywire grenades do hurt buildings just as they do vehicles, and that's on page 110. I think the building damage chart's gotten a lot easier than it was in the last edition. It's less confusing. It was very confusing in how vehicle building damage was. It was hard to understand. This edition is very clear cut. You basically, if you get down to 0 hull points, or if you get down to 0 armor value on any facing, it's destroyed. A building that has detonated is treated as impassable terrain, rubble, or crater. We don't really know. They don't really say. They say it detonates and everything has to get out of it, but they don't really say what happens to it afterwards. I would guess it's a crater. I don't know. Maybe it's rubble. Who knows? That's on page 111. You guys are going to have to decide. Someone's going to have to decide. Gun emplacements are not fire points. Fire points are separate. I know sometimes people were shooting weapons out of gun emplacement spots on like bastions, but it looks like they're separate fire points. That's on page 112. Auto guns can fire at different targets as long as it is the closest enemy target available. That's on page 112. Battlements do not count as dangerous terrain for bikes and skimmers. That's on page 112. That's pretty cool. So if your skimmer or bike lands on a battlement, it's not a dangerous terrain check. That's cool. A warlord does not need to be a character. However, if he is not a character, he does not receive a warlord trait, and that's page 124. That's actually a really cool change to, well, I don't know if it's a cool change. It's change. Because I noticed when the Tyranid Codex came out that Tervigons weren't characters anymore. So it's like, well, you can't have them as your warlord, because in order to be a warlord, you have to be a character. And the only one that could get away with it was, in 6th edition, was Iandan specifically said you could nominate a Wraith Knight or a Wraith Lord as your warlord, even though Wraith Knights weren't characters. But now it's kind of clarifying that you can nominate it as your warlord, but you don't get to have a warlord trait. And that seems fair. I mean, if you're not a character, how are you going to inspire your your guys that are with you to do something special? So I think that's kind of a neat rule change. Maybe some people won't agree, but at least it allows you to make things like your Tervigon a warlord again, because as it stood in 6th edition, they couldn't. So that's on page 124. So that's a change. Keep that in mind. It came up in a game I had with a friend at our gaming group. He was playing Iandan, and I'm like, yeah, you can't. He doesn't get a warlord trait if you make, your Wraith Lord or your Wraith Knight a warlord, and that was a new change. It was frequently something that he did. A battle-forged army can be made up of any number of attachments. Allied attachments must not be from the same detachment as the primary. That's on page 122. So basically, battle-forged armies can be made up of a bunch of primary detachments and allied detachments and formations, data slates. That just seems a little wacky. I'm sure that most TOs and most events are going to limit that. Even Games Workshop with some of their events is already limiting that stuff. So it just seems, I don't know what GW was thinking about that. There's, basically the other is, basically you can take whatever you want. But I don't see that TO is allowing that too often either, because I think that just has a high abuse potential. With a friendly game, you could always arrange it. People that want to play fluffy things, but I think for tournaments, you're not going to see that. My guess is that you're going to still have the limitations where you have one primary and an allied slot, and that's it, just to kind of keep things fair. Otherwise, you could have things like, oh, I'm going to have a Grav Centurion squad with, two chapter masters on bike, and I've got Inquisition, and I've got Codiez, and I've, you know, it kind of goes on from there. There is a new Warlord trait table. The trait tables are on page 124 and 125. The one that's new is basically kind of works with the Maelstrom tactical cards now. That basically affect how the cards work or how you draw the cards. The rest of them, some of them have changed a little bit. The one that's like the night fighting guy, you can decide if it's night fighting, and if it is night fighting, you get all of your troops get night vision, which is really cool. Sorry, your whole army, not just your troops. Battle Brothers have changed a little bit. The Battle Brothers do benefit from the Allies Warlord trait. That's a different change from 6th edition. Independent characters can join each other. That's the same as 6th edition. However, demons may not join up with Chaos Space Marines, because in the Demons Codex says specifically that they can't join anything that doesn't have demonic instability, which is page 23 of the Chaos Demons Codex. They can use the benefits, like things if one of your primary or allied detachment allows you to re-roll reserves, and you can do that for both all your detachments. Psychic powers can benefit each other. They can repair each other's vehicle. That's a change from last edition. They couldn't do that last time. They actually factored that if you had something that could repair vehicles, it had to be that detachment or that allied detachment or primary, or it couldn't be, they couldn't cross repair each other. Now they can. Here's another big change, which I think is weird. Now you can embark on your Battle Brothers transports. That is amazing. That's a huge game changer. I don't know why they did that. People said that they kind of need to rework the Allies matrix, and they did. But this is like a bigger change, and like all of the Imperium are all Battle Brothers too, so they eliminated a lot of things. Tau got the biggest nerf, I think, and the Imperium got like their bros with like everybody in the Imperium, which just doesn't really quite make sense. Tyranids are still hate everybody except for themselves. At least they can ally with themselves now. That's on page 127, where I was just talking about the Battle Brothers benefits. Allies of convenience cannot come within 1 inch of an ally. I don't know what happens with close combat with that one. I would assume you could, because you can't really help it sometimes. But that's on page 127. Desperate allies, if you're within 6 inches of each other, you roll a die 6. If you roll a 1, basically both squads can't do anything because they're looking at each other going, I don't trust you. Here's another change. That was the same as last edition, but swooping creatures and zooming flyers, the change is now that if they fail that test, they can't turn, and they just go ahead 12 inches or 18 inches respectively. So once again, you could end up crashing and burning again because of that. That's on page 127. Come the Apocalypse, and now Come the Apocalypse can play with each other. They couldn't before. Now I could put my Nids with Eldar if I wanted to. So they're treated as desperate allies, except that when you deploy, you can't deploy within 12 inches of a desperate ally. And that's on page 127 too. So basically they're treated like desperate allies, except when they deploy, they have to be far away from each other. That's kind of a weird changer too. Next we're going to kind of talk about setup on the game table. This kind of depends on the mission type, but for the most part this has changed as well. Basically the terrain is set up first, and then you set up objectives prior to choosing your deployment zone and rolling to choose sides. I think that's really cool, because you put the objectives down first. You don't know which side you're getting, and so there's no bias on where you're going to put the objectives, because when you know your side, you're kind of like, I'm going to put an objective here, so it's easy for me to camp and guard that one. But this way, now you're putting the objectives down before that, so you really can't think that way, because you have no idea which side you're going to get. You don't even know what kind of deployment type it's going to be. So you might put something here within 12 inches of the board edge, in the middle of the board, and all of a sudden you got a hammer and anvil, and you're like, well, no, I'm not even close to that now. I think that's a really, really cool change. I like that change to the mission setup. That's on page 130 and 142. I just really like the way the changes are. I think that's a cool idea, GW, to kind of keep things honest and make it fair, and I really like it. I just think it's a really cool way to do it. For the purposes of First Blood, if the opponents are in close combat and they both achieve First Blood on the same initiative step, then both players get First Blood, or 1 victory point First Blood. That's on page 133. That's kind of a cool thing. So if you're both in close combat, you both happen to kill each other on the same initiative step, you both get a First Blood point. Because I guess it's simultaneous First Blood. Equal First Blood. I don't know. What would it be called? But that's a cool change. Kind of answers the question if that happens. Apparently it must have happened, and it must have been something that they asked a fact, because I never had it happen to me, but it's kind of cool. Proposed rule that the gun emplacements don't count towards First Blood. According to 7th edition, it would. I just think it's kind of nasty that you could just pick out, oh, I'm going to take out that quad gun and now I've got First Blood. But maybe people think that's fair. I don't know. It's on page 133. Now, everything in this edition now, everything counts as a scoring unit, and they can all claim objectives. Your troops from a Battleforged group and your allies from a Battleforged group basically can claim an objective, and you can't contest it unless you have that same rule. So the troops are really good for Battleforged. Here's a weird thing, though. Your vehicles can claim objectives, and so can the buildings. If you've secured a building, like a bastion, and it's within 3 inches of an objective, your building is scoring it. It's weird. That's on page 134. What I really don't feel comfortable with is that your vehicles that are designated transports, they count as whatever the unit they were bought for as. So, like, let's say you have a tac squad and you bought a rhino for it. That rhino is a troop, and basically it can't be contestable unless there's another troop near it. Now, that's not so bad, but let's think about this. Like, you've got a designated transport that's a Land Raider, or a designated transport that is a drop pod. Those are, sometimes you could drop those in on something and they're hard to take out, and now you've got something that's not contestable unless you get another troop there. I don't really agree with the vehicles being able to be non-contestable. I think that's a little too overpowered. I don't know what your guys' opinion are, but that just doesn't seem right. Anyway, next thing, mysterious objectives. You must control the objective to benefit from its effects. Except for number 1, which is sabotage the bomb. Everybody gets to blow up for that one. And that's on page 135. I think that's kind of cool. It clarifies who gets to benefit from the objectives, because sometimes it's like, well, multiple troops are there. In the last edition, like, who benefits from that? I don't know. But now they've clarified you have to control it to benefit from it. Mysterious objectives, grav wave generator. Instead of reducing the charge range or charge distance by half, now it just takes 2 inches off the charge distance. That's different from 6th edition, but I think it's a good change. I think having the charge range was just really harsh for last edition. That's on page 135. Night fighting must be agreed upon by the players, and it's only on turn 1, and it gives stealth to everyone. There's no distance modifiers. There's only turn 1. You don't roll for it later on to see if it comes in. I think most people forgot about that anyway. I was terrible about it. If we didn't have night fighting on first turn, I always forgot to roll for it. So I think that's a good change. I'm good with that. And I think just making everything stealth and not having to measure distance or how far you could shoot, I like this change. It makes night fighting simpler. I'm cool with it. But maybe other people aren't. Reserves that can come in can use psychic powers in the turn that they come in, unless they're embarked on a transport. which we talked about earlier about psychers embarked on transport. That's on page 135. That's a change because last time they'd come in from reserve and you couldn't do psychic powers because they started at the beginning of the turn. Technically, you didn't come on at the beginning of the turn. Now there's a whole new psychic phase, so it doesn't even matter because that point's moot at this point. That's on page 135. Tactical cards are discarded once achieved. Most games, you can just discard one that you don't want to use once per turn. These tactical objective cards, I just think they're not. They're an awesome idea. When I first heard them, I'm like, this is great. This is awesome. This is exciting. It's a new way to make a game. But after playing it a few times, I gotta tell you, it's just not. It's not really fair. Like, somebody always gets the better draw, and then once they really pull ahead, it's hard for the other person to catch up. And I just don't think it's very fair. Just the luck of the draw. There's really no, battle plan or being crafty. It's just who's ever luckiest and gets the good cards. And so I don't think that's a really good way to run a tournament. I think most tournament organizers probably won't use those objective cards. So they're cool. I just don't think they're going to see a lot of use. And that's on page 137. In the Relic mission, which are the Eternal War missions, they're the same as last edition. They got a few little changes to them because now everything scores. In the Relic mission, you may not run with the Relic, which is the same as last time. However, you may move it in other phases, just not more than 6 inches. So if your squad can assault move, like the bikes, jet bikes, they could potentially assault move and just not move more than 6 inches with the one that's carrying the Relic. So a little bit of a change. That's page 147. The special rule that, and they shall know no fear, which the Space Marines have, they auto-regroup just as they did before if they're routed. However, instead of before where they got to have a 3-inch consolidation move after routing, and they got to move normally, so basically got a 9-inch move if they ran, now they can just move the 6 inches. They don't get the 3-inch consolidation. And that's on page 157. I think that's a fair change because that was the dumbest thing in the world in the last edition. So I'm glad they changed that. That needed to be fixed. Those that are embarked on an assault vehicle cannot disembark and assault the turn that they come in from reserve. So they come through out of reserve. They can't assault that turn. That's on page 157. Blast weapons, casualties are taken from the closest models, even if the closest model is out of line of sight from the attacking unit. Cover is still able to be taken with blast weapons, but the casualties are taken closest, even if they can't see them. That's on page 158. That's a change from last edition. I don't really understand that. I don't really get it. I mean, barrage I get, but blast weapons I don't think should be able to take things that they can't see, but that's the way it is. Another change now too is that with a squad with mixed weapons, you have to do every weapon separate. So let's say there's a tactical squad and one of them has a flamer and then the rest have bolters and one has a missile launcher. Now you have to do them all separate. So you want to probably do your short range stuff first. So you fire your flamer and then you kill guys off that you can, and your bolters can only kill the maximum range, 24 inches. And so if you've already taken some out of the pool, you may not have as many as close. And then, of course, you'd want to fire the missile launcher separate or last because that's got the longest range. So you have to be careful on when you shoot what, because you have to kind of do those things separate. That's a change from last edition. I think it's a fair change because it was kind of abused last edition. It's like, oh, I've got a missile launcher and I've got bolters, so now all my bolters magically have range to kill everything within 70 or 48 inches. And my flamer can mysteriously do that too. And that was just kind of dumb. I'm glad they changed that. And I think that was a welcome change. The Apocalyptic Mega Blast weapon, cover is determined from the center of the blast out, just like a barrage weapon. That's on page 158. If the wielder of a weapon has line of sight with a barrage weapon, it may fire within the minimum range. That's on page 160. That is a big change. And think about this. They made a minimum range on some of these weapons, like the Manicore now and the Basilisk, which always had a really long minimum range. Now, if you have line of sight, you can shoot those weapons, and even if you're inside the minimum range, so that makes those weapons viable again. Whereas the Manicore wasn't so great when the first IG first came out, the new edition. They're like, well, this kind of sucks. The Manicore has like a really long minimum range, so no one's going to be able to use it. Well, now it doesn't matter. If you got a line of sight, you can shoot it. Barrage weapons hit vehicles on their side armor. That's on page 160. Barrage weapons with multiple blasts, wound allocation is taken starting from the center of the first blast only. That's on page 160. That's different from last edition. Last edition, you're supposed to keep track of every blast, and you're supposed to take casualties from each blast separately. That was a big pain in the butt. Nobody did it anyway. I'm glad they changed it to this. It's first blast only, and that's where you start with the wound allocations. Apocalyptic Barrage special template. Once you scatter, you then roll for the number of shots it has and consult the chart to see where it hits and where the wounds are taken. The wounds are taken from the center blast, no matter what blast spots it hits. That's on page 160, 161. Counterattack is automatic. You don't have to do a leadership test for it anymore. That's on page 163. That's a big change. Crusader rule. You use an extra dice in the run move and use the highest of the two dice. For sweeping advances, you get to have D3 additional for the result when you try to make a sweeping advance. That's on page 163. Destroyer weapons did change. There's a new chart. 1 does nothing. That's the same as before. On a 2 through 5, for vehicles it does D3 hull points, or the model gets D3 wounds and is allowed cover saves and invulnerable saves. That's a big change from last edition. Last edition, it just wrecked vehicles, and you didn't get any cover saves. On a roll of a 6, you get D6 plus 6 hull points, or the model loses D6 plus 6 wounds with no saves of any kind allowed. Note that Feel No Pain is specifically stated that it cannot be used with destroyer weapons or instant death weapons. I think that's a fair change. I think it's a way that, yeah, you might get lucky and roll that 6 and just kill things, but for the most part, you've got a fair shot with destroyer weapons now. They actually even changed it. They fact it on the Black Library site that it affects Apocalypse games too. So all D weapons are now changed. That's fair. It's page 163. 163. I think that's a fair change. I actually like that. Especially if destroyer weapons are going to be seen in regular games now. I think that's a fair change. It needed to be done. Get hot rolls that are from blast weapons. If you're twin linked, you may re-roll the gets hot roll. That's a change from last edition, and that's on page 164. Grab weapons do not affect buildings. That's on page 164 as well. Grab weapons on a roll of a 6 cause a vehicle to lose a hull point and make it immobilized. Further 6s rolled for graviton weapons cause 2 hull points because the vehicle is already immobilized. And that's on page 164. They do also say that you do get cover saves with grab weapons. I know there was a big, huge debate when grab weapons first came out. Do you get a cover save? Don't you? You do. No independent characters may join units that contain monstrous creatures or vehicles. So that kind of takes care of the Riptides being joined by anybody like they were in last edition. I don't know what they're going to say with the Farside Enclaves. I think it's Ovessa, who is a Riptide that's a bodyguard for Farsight, where the bodyguards can join Farsight. I don't know if they're going to make a special exception for that model. I don't know. That's on page 166. An independent character once joined to a unit is treated as if it is that unit until all of the unit's models are destroyed or until it leaves the unit. So that's a cool change. Kind of clarifies that. That is on page 166. Psychic powers that are cast on a unit with an independent character in it carry with both units once they're separated. So if an independent character leaves a unit after a power has been cast on it, they both have that power affecting them. That was kind of always a question too. It's like, well, who would you cast it on? You cast it on, you know, the independent character or the unit. Now it doesn't matter. It affects both of them. Poison weapons must be higher in strength in order to reroll wounds, and that's on page 169. This is a change from last edition. Last edition, if you had equal to or greater than in strength versus the opponent's toughness, you got to reroll your poison weapon shots. Now it's only if you have a higher strength than the toughness of the opponent. So that's a change from last edition. So keep that in mind when you're using poison weapons, or your opponent is. Make sure they keep track of that, because that's a change from last edition. Precision shots that are snap fired are never precision shots on a roll of a 6. So that's a cool clarification from last edition. That's on 169 as well. Preferred enemy traits allows the bearer to reroll 2 hit and 2 wound rolls of 1 in both the shooting and close combat phases. That's on page 169. If a scout unit moved, it cannot assault the first game turn. Page 171. Smash. If you use the special smash rule, you can double your strength to a maximum of 10, but then you only get 1 attack. Otherwise, you're AP2. So that rule changed from last edition. Last edition did the same thing, except you got to do half your attacks. Well, now you only get 1 attack. That's on page 171. That's a big change, because that's a little bit of a nerf from last edition, because now with monstrous creatures, you're not going to be able to just rip apart a vehicle. If you're against another monstrous creature and you're only strength 10 and they're toughness 8, like a Wraith Knight, you might not be able to take it out in 1 turn, because if you have to smash, you're only going to get 1 wound, maybe. Sniper strength against vehicles is now just straight strength 4. There's not rending involved now. Last edition it was strength 3 plus rending. Now it's strength 4, no rending on a vehicle for sniper rifles. That's on page 172. Split fire does not require a leadership test now. It just happens. That's kind of like counterattack. That's on page 172. Strike down. Strike down if a model is wounded by a model with strike down. Then it moves as if it's in difficult terrain the next turn. That's on page 172. Swarms. Each wound from a template or blast weapon counts as 2, unless the weapon causes instant death on the swarm base. Swarms are not slowed by difficult terrain, but they must take dangerous terrain checks as normal. That's in the rulebook 172. A template that hits a fire point in a building or an open-top vehicle, then the occupants inside take D6 strength and AP, that's whatever the weapon is. So that's a big change from last edition too. Last edition you could fire into a fire point of a building and hit the dudes inside. But now, think about this, like you have a flamer or something that's hitting an open-top vehicle, like a Dark Eldar vehicle or an Orc vehicle like a truck. A flamer is going to hit D6 dudes inside at that strength and at the AP. So that flamer is going to hurt dudes inside the vehicle because it's open-topped. So that's a change from last edition. That's a big change. It's something to really think about, because as an open-top vehicle player or as a person attacking an open-top vehicle, you may just decide to flamer a vehicle. You know it's not going to hurt the vehicle, but you know it's going to hurt the guys inside. That's a cool change. And that's on page 173. Alright. So, alright, we're getting down to the end here. Vector striking. Now it causes only 1 hit and ignores cover, and it's randomly allocated to the unit it hits. It hits a vehicle and its side armor, and it hits the like unit at its unmodified strength, but it is at AP2 now. If the target is a zooming flyer or a flying monstrous creature that's swooping, then you get D3 hits instead of 1. This is a big change because this kind of nerfs vector striking. Now you only get 1 hit. It is AP2 now versus AP3, which is an improvement, but now you only get 1 hit. If it's a flyer or a swooping flying monster creature, you get D3 instead of D3 plus 1 like it was in the last edition. It's a change. It's on page 174. It's a change. I've played this new edition I've so far only played with my NIDs, and I'm still using Hive Crones, and they're still doing pretty good. Yeah, it's a little bit of a setback, but honestly, I think it's fine. I don't think it's that bad. It does hit the Helldrakes a little worse because Helldrakes get that, and their Flamer got nerfed again. It used to have they FAQ'd it at the Black Library site. They used to have a 360 turret. Now the Flamer only has a 45-degree angle like it did in the beginning when the rulebook first came out. So the Helldrake really kind of took a nerf in this new edition. Zealots are fearless, and they reroll hits in the first round of close combat. That's on page 174. So that's the main rulebook and rules. I'm actually going to stop here because the psychic powers I'm going to go through is a separate talk, because that's kind of a separate talk unto itself. But I'm going to stop here with the rules. Hopefully this helped you guys. You gleaned some information. It wasn't too boring, and you learned something, because like I said, the main reason I did it is I listened to a lot of the talks with the new 7th edition coming out there, and I saw some people just kind of gleaming through things or saying that they were the same as before, and I just don't think they read them close enough to realize that they had changed. And I think it's important you guys realize that there are these changes out there, because the sooner you learn them, then you're going to learn to play the game correctly, versus learning and going into old habits and not having the rules right and either getting into trouble or, forgetting something that you need to do. So hopefully this was helpful. This is Wargamer Shawn. I hope you like it, and hopefully you'll subscribe, and we'll talk to you soon. Thanks.